Welcome to the DMF. I am your host, Justin Yance, and today my guest is Evan Crooke, who is a distributor, a producer, a director, and a writer. Enjoy. This is part two. That
It is.
brings us to you went to the University of Tampa.
I
Talk a
did.
little bit about that.
Oh yeah, I went there. Well, first of all, let me speak briefly.
Mm-hmm.
Some people might relate to this or may not. May or may not be helpful. But so growing up, I had I had horrible learning disabilities. I had dyslexia. I had so when I was in high school, I was probably 3 to 4 grade levels behind, and I had a real hard time. And even before that, when I was, I guess, 3 to 7 years old, I had a terrible speech impediment. No one could understand me, believe it or not, except for my dad. And out of frustration, I went to my dad and mom, apparently, and I do remember vaguely going to these speech therapy classes on a weekly basis, and they took me because I was really frustrated. And now today it's the most annoying gift I have, which is over speaking, talking more than I should. But so I had speech impediments, and then I had learning disabilities. And when given the time, my test scores were above normal, my grades were always good, solid A's, and but in a standardized, normal sort of setting of measuring stuff, I was behind. And so in high school, I spent probably 2 or 3 summers just working relentlessly trying to catch up. By the end of high school, I had gone from 3 or 4 grade levels behind to actually surpassing college level before I graduated high school, and had gone into like the second year into college based on test scores. So I had really caught up. I was also on the student council, and then ended up graduating at the top of my class in sort of high school. But with all that said, I was going to a school that was for learning disabled children. There was very little understanding when I was growing up about learning disabilities. There was more when I was coming up through the ranks than there was before me, but still in general, there was very little about it. And when back in the day, they would put a learning disabled child in public school, they would put a learning disabled child in, say, the same room as a retarded child. Well, the difference is a retarded person's IQ was anywhere between 30 to 50. A learning disabled child's IQ would be anywhere from 100 to 125. Big difference. And so, and learning disabled was misdiagnosed as being lazy, or being diagnosed as being lazy and stupid, and neither were correct. And so so the principal or the vice president or vice principal rather of my high school told my dad that I would never get into a normal college, basically that I was too stupid. Not a nice thing to say. It made me only work harder, and I ended up getting into multiple colleges, including Syracuse University. I got into a few really well-known schools, but I ended up leaving Pennsylvania and going to Florida because it was warm. I was tired of the cold. Prior to Pennsylvania, we were in Syracuse. I was growing up in Syracuse, and that was brutal, absolutely brutal as far as the weather is concerned. So I went to the University of Tampa, and had a great experience, but also had to work really hard. And so to give you an idea of that process, I found out early on when I was in high school, I would not do well on certain things the way other students might do well on tests or whatever. So what I started doing is recording. No one told this to me. I just sort of felt what I needed. I started recording the lectures. I would sit in the front of the class. I would record the lecture, and the teachers' teachings. And then I would go home. I would listen to the recording. I would write it down. I would listen again. And then my grade started going up. And so what I realized, and what people around me realized, is that one of my learning disabilities is that I needed to visually see it, and I needed to hear it audio wise. I needed video and see it. And it wasn't memorization. I actually was learning it. I had to learn it. I wasn't a guy that could memorize something and then go in and just ace the test. That's not how my wires in my head were configured. So over time in high school through to college, I really learned how to adapt and compensate and know what tools were helping me and what tools weren't, and what was working and what was not working, and then getting results. And I think out of that, I started to really appreciate that process. And that's where I started to respect that process. So by the time I got to college, I had graduated University of Tampa, I think 3.9, almost a 4.0. I was on the honors list. I was on the dean's list. I was in all kinds of programs. I had won the Fuji scholarship kind of thing that they gave some money on a documentary that I did that was well respected. I was the head of my class in the communication department. I had gotten into graduate school at Cal Arts. I had gone for a bit at NYU, and so, but none of that would have been possible if I had not committed myself to the process and really stayed focused with it. And it was agonizingly painful, particularly in the first 23 years of my life, 24 years of my life. It was torture. I mean, it was really, really uncomfortable. So the average person that would go into a class and spend 2 hours in a lecture, let's say at college, would go home and maybe do 30 minutes of homework, right? Okay, maybe it's 40, whatever. For me, it was 2 hours at a lecture, plus listen to the 2-hour lecture again. So now it's 4 hours, then another hour to do the homework. So it was 5 hours, 4 to 5 hours extra when it's all, said and done, of commitment just to be able to master that class. But the end result was I was getting A's where my peers were getting B's and C's. And the other end result was that I had really sunk myself so much into the data and the process that I had actually learned it. I hadn't memorized it. And so that's what I mean earlier by what I was referring to about a real commitment to the process. If I had it easier and my parents were wealthy growing up, and which they were, and I got lucky there, and then I got lucky with no learning disabilities. My mom wasn't sick and she hadn't died and had all these other things, and I had just been like everyone else. There's a good chance I would have grown up as a spoiled brat like every other rich kid, and would have just not had those things that sculpted my wiring in my head of how I approach things. So more. Yeah.
Do you think you have to go through adversity to learn something like that? Could you learn, say you didn't have a learning disability, could you still get there? Or is that one of the keys to learning is adversity?
I don't think anything really important in life or really, really good has ever been created in the history of time without some adversity. If you look at all history, it doesn't exist. The pyramids, the Constitution of the United States that came together, magnificent piece of writing, nothing. The creation of the car, the space shuttle, nothing, absolutely nothing that's ever been created that has been worth it, that has changed people's lives, did not create some adversity. That didn't come with problems. And anytime you do something new, someone's always there to challenge it. They're either there to challenge it because they doubt you and they want you to fail. They're there to challenge it because they are jealous and want to steal it from you, or they're there just challenging it and there because they're just nasty. And so, so many different reasons, but I don't know anything, nothing in all the history of all the world and the universe that was ever done by any human being that didn't come with enormous obstacles. And anything that happened without obstacles wasn't worth even talking about.
How do we put that more into the culture, that people need to understand that the adversity is the learning tool? Because I don't think that's known.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. That's a good question. The first problem is, let's take their phones away and let's stop having them get their history from Instagram. And
or I'd say, get your history from Instagram, but also back it up with something else so that you can compare and contrast. If you insist on Instagram and stuff, at least have another source so that it's not just one. See, that's the thing. I think let's
talk about first getting our history from a good set of teachers. Let's talk about paying educators the more money, and let's talk about good classroom instructions, and let's talk about good hands-on in the field real experiences at an earlier age, as opposed to non-reality and things that have no connection. Let's connect the dots in real time, and let's find creative ways to keep younger people entertained and enjoying it, and find ways that they can enjoy the process. Everybody has pain they can tap into. Most people are lucky. They don't have, learning disabilities is a real problem. It affects millions and millions of human beings around the world, but overall, it's a small problem. And it's a hidden problem. It's not like it's a disability where you have a physical handicap that someone can obviously notice it. Anyone who comes in contact with me doesn't know the struggles that I've had with that, and thinks automatically that life was a piece of cake. And so there were many dark days that really I had to struggle to find, get through things. To this day, my weakest situation still is my spelling is not great, and my grammar, but overall, I've pretty much have compensated on all levels. And have caught and excelled beyond. But I think that's the other thing, is adults always think that the learning curve is always over. Once you reach a certain plateau that you no longer learn. That's absolutely not true. And you're always capable of learning. Even if you're 90 years old, you can always learn something that you hadn't learned before. The question is, are you willing to? And most people get more rigid and more stuck in their ways as they get older, and they convince themselves that they don't need to do this and this and that. And they also have an entitlement issue. We're not entitled to anything. And so the process is really important. And what I love about creating and the creative process of telling stories is it really does involve a process. It really evolves over time, and it's very, very challenging. And while, if you focus, like my writer and I, we're working on this story based on a novella, and we spent months focused on just the lead killer, just in this thriller, and breaking down this killer's background and psychological and rituals and what this killer does and what they don't do, and applying rules to the killer and applying rules to this character and so on. All this before he even starts writing the script. It's been very helpful, and it's been a very, very long process. But I think, going through these kinds of things can help sometimes. But, everyone's journey is different. That's the other thing. And then everybody in Hollywood, I had somebody at a school, I think it was Woodbury or UCLA, somewhere I was teaching. I was doing sort of an adjunct teaching thing where I was brought in to teach a class or two. And one student asked me, they said, well, this is years ago. She said, well, how do I get to be like Spike Lee or Spielberg? And I said, well, I don't understand what that question is. What do you mean by that? She said, well, how do I get that notoriety? How do I get, to the end of the rainbow, essentially, right? How do I get those awards and that money and this? And I said, you're asking the wrong question. You need to
Yes.
first ask yourself, what do you enjoy doing? What makes you excited? What gives you that umph, that the energy that is worth living? And she couldn't answer the question. And I said, you need to first figure that out first. And the questions that you're asking are irrelevant. They're completely irrelevant.
But it goes back to what we were just talking about, the result oriented. She's putting the result, she's already looking at the result, and it's like, but you got to understand that you got to love the process
right.
in order to do that.
Correct.
And Spike Lee, Spielberg, all those people enjoy that process.
Yeah.
Or they wouldn't be doing it.
Yeah. I think, I've been working on a documentary on my dad and his life, because he had a very different life than I had, but a remarkable life. And he's done remarkable things for people. And I think one of the areas that never dawned on me until recently that I was alluding to earlier is where we connect is that process. Now, my dad became one of the top leaders in the scientific world. And most people in the scientific world, scientists, doctors, pharmacists, whatever, they generally come from a privileged lifestyle, meaning that their parents were fairly wealthy or middle class. In my dad's situation, he came from real poverty, literally off the streets, and became one of the youngest scientists to run some of the biggest biotech pharmaceutical companies in the world. And he got a lot of degrees in a very short period of time because he's very smart. But I also think he encountered enormous obstacles growing up, tremendous obstacles that most people would never encounter, including living literally off the streets as a kid. I mean, 8, 9, 10, 12 years old, and very impoverished and dealing with lots of bad things around him. And I think he had to find ways to adjust, compensate, and live through a difficult set of processes that channeled him in different directions, but in the end kept him alive and gave him a set of skills that allowed him to be where he is today. And so I think where we respect each other a lot is that the challenges that I had were very different than the challenges that he had, but yet we both went through a journey that was very challenging, very difficult. And so I had terrible learning disabilities. I had speech impediments, and my mom was dying and was sick most of my life. And I found her dead at the age of 14 when I came home from high school. So that wasn't a good day. But on my dad's side, he had a horrible upbringing. His mom was absolutely terrible. He came from absolute poverty. He lived in a house that was 400 square feet with his mom and his cousins and his brothers, and no bathroom. And I mean, we're talking awful. And at one point lived in a tar paper shack under a bridge. I mean, literally under a bridge. So obstacle after obstacle, and every person that he grew up with when he was a kid ended up either dead or in jail, for real. No question about it. And one of his friends that he was heading to his house, his friend's father blew his brains out on the patio because his son had borrowed the car the night before and blew his brains out with a shotgun. So he had really incredible world of poverty, followed by real world of crime and real world of violence. I mean, extreme.
But he was able to overcome that.
He was able to overcome all that and became an intellectual, a scientist, dedicated to saving people's lives, and of course became a great father. But that process, that going through obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, and each obstacle being almost worse than the one before sometimes, really made him who he is today, which, he's built of steel. And so I think that's where we intersect. I think that's where, we appreciate each other on that level quite a bit.
I think also for you, you had that role model of somebody who went through that and you were able to relate. I didn't have dyslexia, but I had some fine motor processing and auditory processing issues.
Okay. So you
My
understand that.
so I understand learning this because
Yeah,
I'm one. I know what it's like to be in the
sure,
classroom. It's like everybody else is done.
sure.
I'm not done yet.
Yeah, of course.
And teachers
Exactly.
looking at you like
Right.
my mother would
Exactly.
fight these teachers to give me extra time. And
Sure.
I'd have to
Sure.
deal with their prejudices against me, like I'm
Sure.
cheating or something. So I know
Right.
exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, that about does it for part 2 of my interview with Evan Crooke. I hope you enjoyed it. I want to thank him personally for coming on. As always, you can find me at Justin Yachts. Please like, share, and subscribe, and consider checking out the YouTube channel. And I will see you next time on the DMF.